Protect your DNA. BioPQQ can promote formation of new mitochondria. Infowarsstore.com.
But here's their exclusive report that they have here. And this is a teaser for their interview. They say President Trump says construction of the border wall will begin in months. This was the news that came out of their exclusive interview that they don't want anybody to air unless we pay them or follow their strict rules. What he said in this interview, he said, all it is we'll be reimbursed at a later date for building the wall at whatever transaction we make from Mexico. I'm just telling you, there will be a payment. It will be in the form, perhaps a complicated form. Well, what form will this payment for the wall take? We saw yesterday that Mexico was saying, we're ready to quit NAFTA if the U.S. talks fail. And this was reported by AFP. They said Mexico drew red lines on Tuesday. So during the U.S. election campaign, Trump vowed to make Mexico pay for a massive border wall and threatened to finance it by tapping into the $25 billion in remittances that Mexican migrants sent home last year. Asked whether the Mexican delegation would walk away from the negotiating table if the wall and the remittances were an issue, the spokesman for Mexico said absolutely. Now, with NAFTA, 80% of Mexico's exports go to the United States. And as they point out in the article, it's a clear indicator of the country's dependence on the U.S. market for its economic well-being. But nevertheless, Mexican government officials warned on Tuesday that Mexico is also willing to exit the 23-year-old NAFTA agreement. In other words, they're going to take the ball and they're going to go home. But I would say that if they're selling 80% of their exports to the United States, I think the U.S. owns that football, not Mexico. When you look at the deficit of payments, regardless of the remittances that were sent home by Mexican migrants who are working here, foreign citizens who are working here illegally, it's not just the 80% of their trade, and it's not just the billions of dollars that are sent back by Mexican migrants. It's also the fact that they have a surplus trade with the United States of $60 to $75 billion a year. Now, if we go back 23 years before NAFTA, there was roughly a trade parity. Some years they would have a surplus, some years the U.S. would have a trade surplus. Immediately after NAFTA, we had a $15 billion trade deficit with them, about 3 times bigger than the trade deficits that we'd had before, the worst trade deficits we'd had before, and it never got smaller than $15 billion. It's been about $60 to $75 billion the last several years. So they're already going to be paying for this in terms of factories that are not going to be moving to Mexico, as well as factories that are going to be coming back to the United States. But what else will they do? Of course, today we saw that Trump has signed orders on the border wall as well as on immigration enforcement. The Hill points out that President Trump today signed 2 executive orders on immigration, including one that directs federal agencies to begin construction of a wall on the border of Mexico. And that was, of course, the centerpiece of his campaign. That was what began the Trump train, if we go back and look at the presidential campaign. Trump repeated again today, a nation without borders is not a nation. Beginning today, the United States of America gets back control of its borders. The president said his directive will save thousands of lives, millions of jobs, and billions of dollars. He called for the construction of, quote, a large physical barrier on the southern border. The other executive order that he signed today deals with immigration enforcement and ends the catch and release program. Now, understand, this is something that was begun not even by Obama, but by George W. Bush. This is something that the Republican and Democrat establishment have been pushing. He is now pushing that back. He said federal agents are going to unapologetically enforce the law, no ifs, ands, or buts, said Sean Spicer, press secretary. The immigration actions, as the Hill reports, also seek to withhold visas from countries to make sure that they take back people in the U.S. illegally who have found to have broken laws in the U.S. It would also strip federal grants from sanctuary cities and states that do not enforce federal immigration laws. And we're going to take a look at the conflict that has begun on that, especially here in Texas with Governor Abbott. That has been the center point of the conflict here with a local sheriff in Austin and the governor of Texas. We're going to take a look at that in just a moment. But before we do, I want to go back and take a look. We're now only, less than a week into the Trump administration. He was sworn in on Friday. Over the weekend, there was essentially, he said day one was going to be Monday, but of course things happened even over the weekend, and we have seen massive moves, and I would say we've seen a lot of promises that were made as promises that have been kept. And of course, the Wall Street Journal is saying the same thing. They say the new Trump White House website sets an agenda that mirrors their campaign pledges. Well, I would just say it keeps the campaign pledges that we've seen. So let's take a look at some of these. Let's go to the whitehouse.gov site, and let's take a look at some of the memorandums that have come out and press releases from the White House itself pointing out what has happened. And of course, there's the Trans-Pacific Partnership. It was one of the first things that Donald Trump shut down. But I want to read you the language that he said. He said, I hereby direct you to withdraw the United States as a signatory to the Trans-Pacific Partnership, TPP, to permanently withdraw the United States from TPP negotiations and to begin pursuing, wherever possible, bilateral trade negotiations. Understand, bilateral trade negotiations. In other words, we're going to set up agreements between the U.S. and Britain, or between the U.S. and Germany, or between the U.S. and Mexico. Those are going to be much easier to negotiate than these massive multilateral trade agreements that are going to involve many nations all at once. It will be fair, it'll be clear what's going to happen, and it isn't going to involve the loss of sovereignty and the other things that they snuck into this trade agreement. You understand that with the TPP trade agreement, they were going to create an international trade commission that could amend this agreement, whatever it was that passed, and we weren't allowed to see it for the longest amount of time, and they were going to run it through the Congress without any kind of amendment or debate. And once it ran through, this small, unelected, unaccountable international commission was going to have the freedom to change it at will. And they would be able to add countries to it at will as well. Let's take a look at one of the other things that Donald Trump did, minimizing the economic burden of the Affordable Care Act and pending repeal. Here's another statement, immediate release from the White House. They said, it is the policy of my administration to seek the prompt repeal of the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act. In the meantime, pending such repeal, it is imperative to take all actions consistent with law to minimize the unwarranted economic and regulatory burdens of the act, to prepare to afford the states more flexibility, more control, to create a more free and open health care market. He also said he's going to exercise all authority and discretion available to waive, defer, grant exemptions from, delay the implementation of any provisions or requirement that would impose a fiscal burden on any state or cost, fee, tax, penalty, or regulatory burden on individuals, families, healthcare providers, health insurers, et cetera, et cetera. Do you understand the chains that were taken off of the American public at every level? Individuals, businesses of all types, as well as state governments. He removed that and said, we're going to repeal this, but in the meantime, you do everything that you can to get rid of these burdens that have been placed on the American public, the chains that have been put on us by Obama with the quote-unquote Affordable Health Care Act. The next one, memorandum for the heads of executive departments and agencies. Subject to any exemptions, we're going to, like emergency situations or urgent circumstances, you will send no regulation to the Office of the Federal Register until a department or agency head appointed or designated by the President after noon on January 20th reviews and approves the regulation. See what's happening? We had midnight regulations by the tens of thousands being run through by Obama as well as other organizations like the EPA. And what he's saying is, this is going to stop. And if they have recorded this, but they haven't published this, you're not going to publish it. We're stopping these regulations right now, and you're going to have to get approval of the heads that have been appointed by Donald Trump. Then he goes on with a hiring freeze, and then he goes on with expediting infrastructure projects, pointing out that the regulations that the federal government has put in have actually increased pollution, increased expenses to everyone else. That's the human cost, the environmental cost has been exactly the opposite direction.
In case you haven't heard, Infowars has become the most influential media outlet in America. We're making freedom go viral. And now we are proud to announce a new weapon in the epic battle against the globalists. Infowars Prime, where you can watch live high-definition feeds of The Alex Jones Show, plus exclusive insider videos from the Infowars crew and behind-the-scenes action. Go to Infowars.com/app and download today. today. Infowars Prime is available right now for your iPhone or Android. You will have access to exclusive videos that you can't see anywhere else. And that means live coverage of events and breaking news on location as it happens. You can also take advantage of amazing deals from the Infowars store that are only available for Infowars Prime subscribers. That's Infowars Prime at Infowars.com/app. And if you can hear my voice, you are the resistance.